won the love that felt safe. He loved her as long as she didn't need anything. If stories like this make your chest feel a little tighter, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't shout, it whispers, and it changes you. At the beginning, it wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, clean, almost perfect in the way a quiet room can feel perfect. Lila didn't fall in love with grand promises. She fell in love with the ease. The way Evan would text back fast when the day was light. The way he'd show up with coffee, smiling like nothing in the world could touch him. The way he listened, really listened, when her stories were soft. Simple, harmless. With him, life felt organized. No chaos, no sharp edges. Just a calm that made her think. Finally, someone steady. And Evan, he loved that version of her. The version that didn't ask for much. The version that laughed easily, kept things positive, forgave quickly. The version that made love feel like a smooth road with no potholes. He called her peace. He told her she was different. And when he said those words, Lila believed she'd found something rare. Because he didn't disappear. He didn't cheat. He didn't scream. He simply stayed in the places where love was easy to carry. Their nights were warm. Movies with shared blankets. Late dinners where the city lights made everything feel softer than it really was. His hand on her knee. Like a quiet promise, I'm here. And for a while, that was enough. Lila started building a future in her mind without even realizing it. Not a fantasy. Just a small, ordinary future, safe mornings, steady affection, a partner who wouldn't leave. But the thing about safe love is that sometimes it only feels safe because it hasn't been tested yet. Because there's a kind of love that shines when the weather is good, and vanishes the moment the sky changes. Back then, Lila didn't know that. She only knew what she could feel in the moment. A man who looked at her like she was easy to love. And a quiet hope that maybe she would never have to beg for presents again. But that hope was about to learn the difference between being loved and being held. To the first quiet absence. It didn't start with a fight. It started with a delay. A message that used to come in 5 minutes took 5 hours. A call that used to be answered on the second ring went to voicemail. And when Evan finally showed up, he had the same calm face. The same steady voice, like nothing had happened. Long day, he said, like it explained everything. Lila smiled like she believed him. Because that's what you do when you don't want to seem needy. You play it cool, you swallow the question, you tell yourself, this is normal, people get busy. But her body didn't believe the story her mouth was telling. She felt it in the quiet space between their texts. In the way the room sounded louder when she was alone. In the way she checked her phone. Not because she was obsessed, but because her nervous system was waiting for proof that she still mattered. When Evan did text, it was light, practical, safe. Made it home. Talk tomorrow. A heart emoji that felt like a stamp, not a touch. And Lila kept answering the same way, soft. Understanding, low maintenance. Because she had learned, long before Evan, that love could be taken away for asking too much. So she adjusted without saying she was adjusting. She stopped sending long messages. Stopped telling him when her chest felt tight at night. Stopped mentioning her mother's doctor appointment. Because she didn't want to add weight to his day. She turned her feelings into a silent file she stored away. Neatly labeled, not urgent, not important. And Evan seemed to relax. Not because he didn't care. But because her silence made the relationship easier for him to carry. That's the thing about emotionally unavailable people. They don't always leave the relationship. Sometimes they stay, but only in the parts of you that don't require them to show up. The first time Lila tried to say it, just a little, she kept her voice sweet. Like she was describing the weather. Hey, I didn't hear from you much yesterday. Evan didn't get angry. He didn't apologize either. He just looked away for a second. Like the conversation had suddenly become uncomfortable. I told you I was busy. He said, calm, controlled. Not cruel, just closed. Lila nodded too fast. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean. She cut herself off, because she could feel it, the emotional door sliding shut. And in that moment, she made a quiet decision without realizing it. If I want him to stay, I have to become someone who doesn't need him. So she became easy again. She laughed. She changed the subject. She carried the loneliness like a small purse, light enough to hide, heavy enough to hurt. And Evan stayed. But Lila started to notice something terrifying. He wasn't disappearing from his life. He was only disappearing from hers. Whenever her heart asked for more than convenience. That was the first quiet absence. Not the kind you can point at. Not the kind your friends can see. Just the kind that teaches you to miss someone, while they're still technically yours. Redefining abandonment. Lila used to think abandonment meant someone leaving. A door slammed, a suitcase, a breakup text you reread until the screen goes dark. But what she was living through with Evan didn't look like that. Evan was still there. He still kissed her forehead before work. Still asked, "How was your day?" in that steady voice. Still showed up to dinner. Still paid the bill. Still drove her home like a responsible man. And that's what made it confusing, almost dangerous. Because nothing was wrong enough to name. Yet her chest kept learning the same lesson. I can have him and still be alone. Abandonment, she realized, isn't always absence. Sometimes it's presence without contact. It's when you reach emotionally, and your hand closes around air. When you share something tender, and it lands like a pebble thrown into a deep well, no echo coming back. It's the way he could sit beside her on the couch, scrolling through his phone, while her eyes quietly begged, "Please, notice me." It's the way his sounded like a closing statement, not an invitation. It's the way her tears, when she couldn't hold them in, made him stiffen. As if her feelings were a problem to solve, not a person to hold. Evan didn't say, "Stop." He didn't say, "I don't care." He just went quiet. And the quiet made Lila feel childish for even needing warmth. So she began translating her needs into something reasonable. Instead of, "I miss you," she said, "Hope your day's going okay." Instead of, "Can you stay with me tonight?" she said, "No worries, get some rest." Instead of, "I'm not okay," she said, "I'm fine," with a smile that felt like work. Because if she asked directly, she could feel him retreat. Not physically, emotionally. Like he was stepping backward inside himself. And Lila started to understand something. Evan wasn't withholding love to punish her. He wasn't playing games. He just didn't know how to be close when closeness required discomfort. He could do light. He could do easy. He could do her laughter, her charm, her "I'm good." But when she brought him fear, grief, doubt, he acted like she'd handed him a language he couldn't read. That was the definition forming in her mind. Abandonment is when your feelings become too much, and someone keeps you only in the version of you that costs them nothing. It's when you learn to split yourself in half. One half gets to be loved. The easy half. The other half gets locked away. The human half. And the hardest part? He wasn't a villain. He didn't look like a man who abandons people. He looked like a man who tries. Who texts. Who shows up. Who remembers birthdays. Which meant Lila couldn't point to one clear wound. She was bleeding in places no one could see. And she kept asking herself the same haunting question. If he's here, why'd I feel like I'm losing him? Because abandonment isn't always a goodbye. Sometimes it's a slow, invisible lesson that teaches you. Don't need too much. Don't feel too loudly. Don't ask for a love that requires someone to stay. For when she needed him. It happened on an ordinary night. The kind of night that's supposed to be forgettable. Lila's phone buzzed with her sister's name. And before she even answered, her stomach knew. Their mother had collapsed at work. Not dramatic, no blood. No sirens in the story yet, just that terrifying sentence, "They're taking her to the ER." Lila grabbed her coat with hands that didn't feel like her own. She called Evan while she walked to her car. Ring. Ring. Voicemail. She tried again. Same result. Her breath came shallow, like her ribs were too tight. So she texted, "Hey, I need you, please call me." Then she sat behind the wheel and stared at the dashboard, waiting for the screen to light up. Nothing. At the hospital, time turned into a hallway. White lights, cold air, the smell of sanitizer that makes everything feel unreal. Her sister was pacing, her mother was behind a door. And Lila was doing the thing she always did, holding it together for everyone else. But every few minutes, she checked her phone. Still nothing. When Evan finally called, it was almost midnight. His voice was calm, as if he'd called to confirm dinner plans. "Hey, what's up?" Lila swallowed hard. "My mom's in the ER," she said, trying to keep her voice from breaking. "I've been calling you." A pause. Not the kind filled with concern. The kind filled with calculation. "Oh," he said, "I was in meetings. Then my phone died." Lila didn't know which part hurt more. That he hadn't answered, or that he said it like it should be enough. I'm scared," she whispered. "Can you come?" Another pause. She could almost hear him weighing it. "I don't know if I can tonight," he said. "I've got an early morning. And you're with your sister, right?" Those words landed like a cold hand on her throat. Yes, she was with her sister. But she wasn't asking for logistics. She was asking for presence. For someone to put a hand on her back and say, "I'm here, you don't have to be strong alone." Lila stared at the hospital floor as if it might hold her up. "It's okay," she heard herself say. The automatic sentence. The sentence that protects the other person from your need. Evan exhaled like relieved air. "Okay, keep me posted," he said, soft, responsible, distant. And then, because he couldn't end without offering something, he added, "Try to get some rest." Rest. As if her fear could be folded neatly into a pillow. After the call, Lila didn't cry right away. She just went numb, like her body shut down to keep her from shattering in public. She sent one text, "They're running tests." And when he replied, it was a single line, "Hope it's nothing serious." Lila read it twice. Hope. Like a stranger. And that's when she understood something she'd been avoiding for months. Evan didn't abandon her by leaving. He abandoned her by staying, only when she didn't require him to feel. That night, she didn't just worry about her mother. She grieved the quiet truth. When she needed him most, his love became optional. And in the fluorescent silence of that waiting room, Lila felt something inside her shift. Not anger, not hatred. Just a clear, aching awareness. I can't keep calling this love, if it only shows up when life is easy. 5. His comfort zone. After the hospital night, Evan didn't vanish. He did something worse, he returned like nothing had changed. The next morning, he sent a text that looked caring from the outside. "Any update on your mom?" Then, 10 minutes later, "I'm slammed today, talk later." Lila stared at the screen and felt that strange split inside her again. The part that wanted to be grateful. And the part that wanted to scream, "Do you know what I went through alone?" When Evan finally came over 2 days later, he brought flowers, not the kind she loved, just the kind people buy when they want to look supportive. He kissed her cheek, held her for exactly one breath, then stepped back. "How's she doing?" he asked. "Already steady, already controlled." Lila told him the facts. Tests, meds, she'll be okay. She watched his shoulders loosen the moment the crisis sounded smaller. "Oh good," he said, like someone closing a tab on a browser. Then he smiled, bright. Easy, like he'd earned the right to return to normal. And that's when Lila saw it clearly. Evan didn't know how to love inside pain. He only knew how to love around it. His comfort zone was a relationship where emotions stayed tidy. Where problems had timelines. Where tears came with a warning label and ended quickly. If Lila cried softly, Evan would offer solutions. "Maybe you should sleep more. Don't overthink. Try to stay positive." But if she cried for real, if she let the grief look messy, His eyes would harden, not with anger, with distance. Like he was watching something he didn't want to touch. He'd change the subject. Make a joke. Offer a distraction. And Lila would go with it. Because she didn't want to be too much. Not again. The pattern became obvious once she named it. When the mood was light, Evan was generous. He planned dinners, he held her hand, he talked about trips. When the mood was heavy, Evan became a ghost who still had a body. Present, but gone. One night, Lila tried a different approach. She kept her voice calm, her words neat, like she was presenting a report. "I don't think you understand what it feels like," she said. "When I'm hurting, I feel alone with you." Evan blinked, slow, defensive. He leaned back, like her sentence pushed air between them. "That's not fair," he said. "I'm here, aren't I?" There it was. His definition of love, physical presence. A man in the room. A text on the screen. A dinner date. But Lila wasn't starving for a schedule. She was starving for emotional contact. For a partner who could sit in discomfort without running. "I'm not saying you're a bad person," she whispered. "I'm saying, I can feel you leave. The second things get real." Evan's jaw tightened. He looked at the TV, then at the floor, anywhere but her eyes. "I don't know what you want me to do," he said. And his tone wasn't cruel. It was the tone of someone who has reached the limit of what he can feel without panicking. Lila felt the truth land in her bones. Evan didn't refuse her pain because he didn't love her. He refused it because pain required a version of him he wasn't willing to become. His comfort zone was easy love. Love that stayed clean. Love that never asked him to grow. And the more Lila tried to bring her whole heart into the relationship, the more Evan tried to shrink the space where her heart could exist. So she did what abandoned people do. She started editing herself again. Not to be honest, but to be acceptable. 6. Inner adaptation begins. Lila didn't announce the change. There was no dramatic decision, no speech, no ultimatum. It was quieter than that. It began with her hands. She stopped reaching for her phone the second she felt lonely. She started waiting, 5 minutes. 10, like she was training a muscle. Not patience. Detachment. When Evan took hours to reply, she told herself, "He's busy." Then she told herself something colder, "It doesn't matter." She began to practice being fine before she actually felt fine. She laughed sooner. She said, "No worries," more often. She kept her voice light, like her sadness was a stain she had to scrub out before he noticed. And Evan loved this version of her. He texted more when she texted less. He called when she stopped asking for calls. He leaned in the moment she leaned back. It was like his affection had a sensor. It activated only when the relationship felt safe for him again. Lila noticed it, and something in her learned a dangerous lesson. If I become easier, I get more love. So she became easier. She edited her words before they left her mouth. She deleted the messages that sounded too emotional. She watched herself like an observer. Is this too much? Is this going to make him shut down? Her needs didn't disappear. They just moved underground. At night, she would lie beside him and stare at the ceiling, counting the soft seconds between his breaths. Her body wanted to curl into him, to be held without asking. But she didn't move. Because asking felt risky now. Like placing a fragile glass on the edge of a table and praying no one bumps it. Sometimes she would whisper to herself in the dark. Don't push, don't press, don't need. And the strangest part was how normal it started to feel. Her friends would say, "You two seem great." Evan would say, "I love how low drama you are." And Lila would smile, because being praised for being low drama felt safer than being seen as needy. She began to self-soothe in small, silent ways. She took longer showers. She played music softly while cooking, so the apartment didn't feel so empty. She wrote things in her notes app that she couldn't say out loud. "I miss you when you're right here. I'm tired of carrying my feelings alone." But she never sent them. Instead, she became fluent in pretending. When he asked, "You okay?" she answered. "Yeah, just tired." When he forgot something important, she said, "It's fine." When she felt the urge to cry, she swallowed it like medicine. Because she was adapting to the only love that seemed available. Love that required her to be small. And that adaptation came with a price. The more she trained herself not to need him, the less she trusted herself to need anyone. She started to believe that needing was weakness. That wanting comfort was childish. That a good woman should be easy to love. But deep down, under all that control, there was a quiet ache she couldn't edit away. She wasn't becoming stronger. She was becoming quieter. And the silence wasn't healing her. It was just making her easier to abandon. Without anyone ever having to leave. 7. Becoming easier to love. Lila became a translator. Not of languages. Of herself. She learned to take the raw truth of what she felt and convert it into something Evan could tolerate. If she missed him, she didn't say, "I miss you." She said, "Hope work's going okay." If she felt lonely, she didn't say, "I'm lonely." She said, "I've just been tired lately." If she needed reassurance, she didn't say, "Please don't leave me emotionally." She said, "No pressure. I know you're busy." Every sentence came with padding. Soft edges. A disclaimer that said, "Don't worry, my needs won't cost you." And Evan responded to that version of her like it was a gift. He smiled more. He relaxed. He held her hand in public again. He texted, "Good morning," like he used to. But only when she stopped asking for it. Lila noticed the reward and hated herself for noticing. Because her heart should not have to earn tenderness by shrinking. But it did. She started anticipating his discomfort the way some people anticipate storms. A small change in his tone. A delayed reply. A long blink when she mentioned something emotional. Those were her warning signs. So she adapted faster. She laughed at jokes she didn't find funny. She said, "It's fine," before he could even ask. She used humor to cover ache. The way makeup covers bruises. And slowly, she became a woman who could carry pain without making a sound. At dinner with his friends, she was perfect. Charming, light, uncomplicated. When someone asked, "How are you two?" Evan would squeeze her knee and say, "Honestly, easy, we're easy." He said it like a compliment. And Lila smiled, because that's what an easy woman does. But later, at home, she would sit on the edge of the bed and feel her own chest tighten with a question she couldn't say out loud. "If I stopped being easy, would you still love me?" She stopped bringing him her fears. She stopped bringing him her grief. She stopped bringing him anything that might make him shut down. And what she got in return was peace. Not real peace. A negotiated peace. The kind of peace that exists when one person stops asking, and the other person stops running. Sometimes Evan would look at her and say, "See, we're good. I knew this would pass." As if her silence meant healing. As if her quiet meant she didn't feel it anymore. But the truth was simple. She wasn't healed. She was edited. She had turned herself into a version that fit inside his comfort zone, a version with lower volume. Smaller needs, softer edges. And that version was easier to love. Because it demanded nothing from him. No emotional risk. No vulnerability. No growth. Just a woman who stayed pleasant while her own heart quietly starved. The scariest part was how the relationship improved on the surface. Less tension. More laughter. More good days. And Lila started to understand why people stay in this kind of love for years. Because when you're the one shrinking, everyone calls it maturity. They call it understanding. They call it being strong. But deep inside, Lila could feel something disappearing. Not Evan. Herself. The version of her that believed love could hold her fully, the crying parts. The messy parts. The human parts. She didn't lose that version in one moment. She lost her in 1,000 tiny choices to be easier. And every choice sounded the same. Don't be too much. Be sweet. Be small. Be easy to love. 8. The cost of staying. The relationship didn't fall apart. That was the problem. From the outside, Lila and Evan looked stable. No screaming matches, no dramatic breakups. Just two adults who worked. But inside Lila, something kept thinning, like a thread pulled too many times. The cost of staying wasn't one big heartbreak. It was 1,000 small payments. She paid with her voice. When something hurt, she swallowed it. When she needed comfort, she negotiated with herself. Wait. Don't ruin the night. When she wanted closeness, she waited for him to offer it, because asking felt like a risk. She paid with her sleep. She would lie awake beside him, listening to the quiet machine of his breathing, wondering how a person could be inches away and still unreachable. Her body would tense at every buzz of his phone, even when it wasn't him pulling away, just work, just noise, just life. And she paid with her identity. Lila began to recognize herself less. Not in a dramatic, I don't know who I am, way. In a softer, scarier way. She stopped telling certain stories. Stopped sharing the parts of her childhood that still ached. Stopped mentioning how her mother's illness made her feel like a little girl again. Those weren't useful emotions in Evan's world. They didn't belong in his comfort zone. So Lila set them down. One by one, like bags she wasn't allowed to carry into the house. Her friends noticed, quietly. You've been quieter, one of them said. Lila laughed and blamed work. But it wasn't work. It was the constant internal editing. The exhausting effort of staying lovable by staying easy. The worst part wasn't even Evan. It was what his pattern taught her about herself. She started to believe she was hard to love. That her feelings were too heavy. That needing support was a flaw. When Evan did show affection, when he touched her waist in the kitchen, when he kissed her neck before leaving, Lila felt relief so sharp it scared her. Because that's what happens when love becomes scarce. You start treating basic tenderness like a miracle. She became grateful for crumbs. And crumbs can keep you alive emotionally. But they can't feed you. Some nights she would stand in the bathroom, staring at her reflection under the harsh light, and think, this is what abandonment looks like. Not leaving. Not betrayal. Just slowly training yourself to accept less. Until less feels normal. She tried to talk to Evan once. Carefully. I feel like I'm always the one adjusting, she said, keeping her voice soft, like I'm shrinking. Evan frowned, confused. I don't want you to feel that way, he said. And it sounded sincere, but it also sounded like a sentence that required no action. Then he added, maybe you're overthinking. And just like that, her truth became a problem inside her, not a reality between them. The cost of staying was that Lila stopped trusting her own signals. She began doubting her pain, questioning her instincts. She became a woman who could be deeply unhappy and still smile at brunch. That's the hidden price of emotional unavailability. It doesn't always break the relationship. Sometimes it breaks the person who keeps waiting. And Lila could feel it happening. Not as a crash, but as a slow dimming. Like a lamp turned down one notch at a time, until you forget what full light ever felt like. 9. Loving alone. Lila didn't stop loving Evan. That would have been cleaner. What happened was harder. She kept loving him, alone. She became the one who remembered. The one who noticed. The one who held the emotional map of their relationship in her head like a second job. She remembered the anniversary of their first date. Evan forgot, not out of cruelty, just out of absence. When she mentioned it softly, he blinked like he'd missed a calendar alert. Oh, right, he said, then kissed her cheek, quick, efficient. Let's do something this weekend. And Lila smiled, because she didn't want to make it a thing. That's how loneliness works in a relationship. You start accepting late affection as if it was on time. She learned to celebrate herself quietly. If she got good news at work, she'd tell Evan. He'd say, nice, without looking up from his laptop. Not because he didn't care, because he didn't know how to enter her excitement. So she would text her friends instead. Call her sister. Clap for herself in the bathroom mirror like a child trying to prove her joy was real. If she had a bad day, she stopped reaching for him. She'd start the sentence, "Today was rough." Then swallow it, because she could already picture his response. Silence, solutions, distraction. Anything but presence. So she carried her pain like a private purse again. Small enough to hide, heavy enough to bruise. Sometimes Evan would wrap his arms around her from behind in the kitchen and say, "You okay? You've been quiet." And Lila would answer automatically, "I'm fine." Because the truth, "I'm lonely with you," felt too dangerous to say more than once. There were nights she would lie in bed next to him, both of them facing the ceiling, separated by inches that felt like miles. His phone would glow with work emails. Her mind would glow with everything she wasn't saying. She wanted to turn toward him and say, "Can you just hold me for a minute, without trying to fix me?" But her mouth stayed closed. Because she had learned the rule. If she asked for emotional closeness, he would retreat. If she stayed easy, he would stay near. So she chose near. And near without contact is its own kind of grief. The relationship started to feel like a stage where she played two roles. She was the girlfriend, smiling, supportive, low maintenance, and she was the unseen caretaker, absorbing silence, translating distance, keeping the peace. Evan didn't notice the double shift she was working. Or maybe he did, and he liked the arrangement. One evening, after a long week of being fine, Lila sat alone on the couch while Evan showered. She watched the reflections of streetlights crawl across the window glass. And she realized something so simple it made her stomach drop. She wasn't waiting to be loved. She was waiting to be met. Because love without meeting you, without seeing you, becomes a performance. She thought about all the tiny ways she'd been reaching for him. Making his coffee the way he liked it. Asking about his day. Listening to his stress like it mattered. Saying, "I understand," even when she didn't. And what did she receive back? Affection when it was convenient. Care when it was easy. A good boyfriend on paper. But on the nights her heart got heavy, she was alone. And she understood the cruelest part of loving alone. You can be loyal. You can be kind. You can be devoted. And still not be held. Still not be chosen, in the moments that count. That's when Lila finally admitted what she'd been afraid to name. She wasn't in a relationship. She was in a waiting room. And she had been sitting there, loving him. Like love could turn a closed door into a home. 10. His silence, her clarity. The clarity didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived like a lamp you forget is dim, until someone turns it up. It was a Tuesday, nothing special. Lila had spent the whole day holding herself together at work, smiling through meetings, answering emails like her heart wasn't dragging behind her. On the drive home, her hands shook on the steering wheel, not from fear, from exhaustion. She walked into the apartment and found Evan on the couch, half watching a game, half scrolling his phone. The room smelled like takeout and screen light. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," he answered, eyes still down. Lila set her keys on the counter and waited for the familiar script. A quick kiss, a casual question, a safe conversation that never touched anything real. But her chest felt too full to keep pretending. "I had a hard day," she said, simple, honest, no drama. Evan nodded once. "Yeah, that sucks," he said, like he was responding to traffic. Lila sat beside him, the couch dipped. She stared at the TV without seeing it. A minute passed. Then another. Evan didn't turn toward her. Didn't ask what happened. Didn't reach for her hand. His silence filled the space like fog. And in that fog, Lila finally understood something she'd been resisting. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the relationship. She wasn't waiting for the real Evan to show up. This quiet distance, was him showing up. A thought rose in her mind, calm and sharp. If I disappeared emotionally the way he does, he wouldn't even notice. Not right away. He'd notice if dinners stopped. If sex stopped. If she stopped being pleasant. But if she stopped being open, if she stopped offering her heart, he would simply enjoy the quiet. Because quiet was his comfort zone. Lila watched him smile at something on his phone. Thumb moving like nothing in the world was urgent. And she felt the last excuse inside her crumble. He wasn't too busy. He wasn't too stressed. He wasn't just not good with emotions. He was choosing not to enter her inner world. Choosing not to meet her. That realization didn't make her hate him. It made her stop bargaining. She turned her head slightly and studied his profile. The calm jaw, the relaxed shoulders, the peaceful face of a man whose relationship asked nothing from him. And she realized how unfair it was that she had been carrying two people's feelings while he carried none. Lila spoke again, quieter. "Evan, can you just be with me for a second?" He sighed, not loudly. But enough. Enough to tell her that her need had become an interruption. "I am with you," he said, still not looking. "I'm right here." There it was again, his definition of love. A body in the room. Lila nodded slowly, and something in her clicked into place like a lock. She didn't want a roommate. She didn't want a man who could physically be present while emotionally absent. She wanted partnership. She wanted warmth that didn't require perfect conditions. She wanted a love that could hold pain without treating it like a problem. Evan's silence had finally given her a gift. The end of confusion. Because when someone consistently meets your feelings with nothing, eventually, the nothing becomes the answer. Lila stood up and walked to the kitchen. Not to make a scene. Not to punish him. Just to breathe. And as she filled a glass with water, she felt it. Not relief, not yet. But clarity. A clean, quiet sentence forming in her mind. "I have been begging for crumbs in a house that will never feed me." And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. 11. Naming the truth. Lila didn't name it right away. She circled it for weeks. Like your tongue circling a sore tooth, afraid to touch it. Unable to stop. At first she called it a rough patch. Then, stress. Then, we're just different. Those words were softer than the truth. They let her keep hoping. But one night, after Evan fell asleep with his back turned, Lila sat at the edge of the bed and opened her phone, not to scroll. Not to distract, just to find a word that fit. She typed, "Why'd I feel lonely in my relationship?" Then, "Partner present but emotionally absent." Then, "He shuts down when I have feelings." The internet offered thousands of explanations, but one phrase kept repeating like a bell. Emotional unavailability. Lila read it and felt her stomach drop, not because it was new, but because it was accurate. Emotionally unavailable doesn't always mean cold. Sometimes it's charming, functional, responsible. Sometimes it looks like a man who can plan a vacation and forget your tears. A man who can talk numbers for hours and go silent when you say, "I'm not okay." She read the signs like they were written about her life. He avoids emotional conversations. He offers solutions instead of comfort. He retreats when you need him most. He praises you for being easy. He acts overwhelmed by normal human needs. And with each line, Lila felt herself getting quieter, not from sadness, but from recognition. Because if this had a name, it meant she wasn't crazy. It meant her body wasn't too sensitive. Her heart wasn't dramatic. She wasn't asking for something unreasonable. She was asking for a basic human thing. To be met. And then the other word came, heavier, older, sharper. Abandonment. Not the Hollywood kind. Not the suitcase kind. The inside the relationship kind. The kind where you learn to hold your feelings alone while someone sits beside you. The kind where you start parenting yourself, soothing yourself, shrinking yourself, so the other person doesn't have to grow. Lila whispered the words into the dark, testing them. Emotionally unavailable. Abandonment. They sounded harsh. They sounded final. But they also sounded clean. Because the truth is, naming something isn't cruelty. It's clarity. And clarity does something terrifying. It removes your excuses. She couldn't say, "He doesn't know." Because she had tried to tell him. She couldn't say, "He's just busy." Because he had time for everything that didn't require vulnerability. She couldn't say, "It's my fault." Because her needs were not sins. Naming the truth didn't change Evan. It changed Lila's posture inside herself. Her shoulders stopped reaching forward. Her hope stopped running ahead. Her mind stopped negotiating. She saw the relationship exactly as it was. A place where her softness was welcome. Until it asked for care. A place where love existed. But only within his comfort zone. And once she had the words, she finally understood the quiet promise she'd been making to herself for months. "I will not keep calling this love if it requires me to disappear." 12. Letting go of hope. Hope was the last thing Lila released. Not love. Not loyalty. Hope. It had been living quietly in her chest, disguised as patience. Hope said, "Maybe next time he'll hear me." Hope said, "He just needs more time." Hope said, "If I explain it better, softer, smaller, he'll meet me." Hope kept her waiting. She stopped bringing it up, not because it didn't matter anymore, but because she already knew how it would end. The nod. The pause. The sentence that sounded caring but required nothing. "I understand," Evan would say. And then nothing would change. Lila began to see hope for what it was in this relationship. A delay of grief. As long as she hoped, she stayed suspended between what was happening and what she wished would happen. As long as she hoped, she could avoid the full weight of the truth. So one night, lying awake while Evan slept, Lila did something radical. She stopped imagining a future where he suddenly became emotionally present. She stopped replaying conversations she hadn't had yet, stopped crafting the perfect sentence that would finally unlock him. She asked herself one simple, devastating question. If nothing about him ever changes, can I live like this? Her body answered before her mind could soften it. No. That answer didn't come with drama. It came with a strange calm, like a storm passing without rain. Letting go of hope felt like stepping out of a room that had been slowly suffocating her. Painful, yes. But honest. She saw how hope had been asking her to betray herself. To wait quietly. To accept half presence as enough. And she realized something that made her throat ache. Hope had been keeping Evan comfortable. Not her. He could stay exactly as he was. Because she kept believing in a version of him that only existed in her imagination. Letting go of hope didn't mean she stopped caring. It meant she stopped pretending. She stopped translating his silence into potential. Stopped turning absence into maybe. The relationship looked different without hope coloring it. It looked small, uneven, heavy on her side. And without hope smoothing the edges, the truth was impossible to ignore. She was alone in her effort. Lila didn't announce this shift. She didn't threaten. She didn't beg. She just stopped waiting. Stopped bracing for the next disappointment. Stopped believing that her needs were homework he'd eventually complete. The grief came, quietly. Not grief for Evan, but for the future she'd been carrying by herself. The trips they never planned. The conversations that never went deep. The safety she never felt when she actually needed it. Letting go of hope meant mourning something that never fully existed. And that was the hardest part. Because you can't fight for something that isn't there. You can't save a relationship that only one person is trying to feel. As Lila lay there in the dark, breathing slowly, she understood. Hope had kept her tied to the waiting room. Letting it go didn't mean she was giving up on love. It meant she was finally choosing herself over the promise of someone else's potential. 13. The grief of what never was. The grief surprised her, not in its intensity, but in its shape. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with sobbing or dramatic collapse. It came quietly, like realizing you've been holding your breath for years, and finally exhaling. Lila wasn't grieving Evan. Not really. She was grieving the version of the future she had carried alone. The conversations that never happened. The nights she imagined where she could fall apart and be held instead of managed. The safety she thought would arrive after she explained herself one more time. That future had felt so real. She had lived inside it in pieces. During long drives. In the shower. Lying awake beside a man who never entered it with her. Letting go of hope had cleared the fog. But it also left a wide, empty space where belief used to be. And that space hurt. She cried one afternoon without knowing why at first. Just standing in the kitchen, sunlight cutting across the counter, tears falling onto nothing important. Her body was grieving before her mind caught up. Because the loss wasn't a person. It was possibility. The possibility that if she stayed kind enough, quiet enough, patient enough, love would eventually become safe. The possibility that effort could turn emotional absence into intimacy. The possibility that she wouldn't have to leave to be seen. That's the strange cruelty of this kind of grief. You mourn something that never existed, but shaped your choices anyway. Lila realized how much energy she had spent loving a ghost of a future. Every compromise, every swallowed sentence, every time she chose peace over truth. She hadn't been foolish. She had been hopeful. And hope, when it's unreturned, leaves a very specific ache. There were moments she almost reached for her phone, to tell Evan how sad she felt. Then she stopped. Not because she didn't want comfort, but because she finally understood where comfort wouldn't come from. That understanding was its own heartbreak. She let herself grieve properly. Not by blaming him. Not by blaming herself. But by admitting the truth she had avoided. She had loved a future that required him to become someone else. And loving that future had cost her the present. As the days passed, the grief shifted. It softened at the edges. It stopped choking her. It became something quieter. A sadness that honored what she had hoped for, without chasing it. Lila noticed something else, too. Without the weight of expectation. Her chest felt lighter. Still sore, but no longer tight. The grief wasn't asking her to go back. It was asking her to stop pretending she'd lost something she could have saved. Because you cannot lose what was never given. You can only release it. And in releasing it, Lila felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the love she never got to receive. Relief that she no longer had to audition for it. The grief of what never was didn't mean she was broken. It meant she was honest. And honesty, even when it hurts, was finally something she could build on. 14 Quiet separation. Lila didn't leave in a storm. She left in a still room. There was no shouting match. No slammed door. No suitcase dragged across the floor. Just a Tuesday evening and a silence that finally felt heavier than fear. Evan was at the kitchen counter, typing on his phone with that familiar half-attention, present enough to say he was there. Absent enough to make her feel alone. Lila watched him for a moment and realized she wasn't angry anymore. Anger needs hope. Anger believes there's something to fight for. What she felt now was calmer than that. Clearer. She spoke softly, like she was afraid to startle him. Evan, I don't think this is working. He looked up, startled, not by the words, but by the fact that she said them without emotion. Without pleading. Without the usual cushioning. What do you mean? He asked. Already reaching for logic. We're fine. Lila nodded slowly. That's the problem, she said. We're fine, and I'm still lonely. Evan's jaw tightened. He glanced away, as if the sentence was something sharp he didn't want in his hands. I don't understand, he said. I'm here. I haven't done anything to you. Lila felt the old reflex rise, the urge to explain, to soften, to make him comfortable. But she didn't. Because she wasn't trying to convince him anymore. She was telling the truth. You don't have to do something bad to leave someone, she whispered. Sometimes you just never arrive. Evan frowned, defensive confusion mixing with irritation. So what? You're breaking up with me because I'm not emotional enough? He asked. Lila swallowed. It's not about being emotional, she said. It's about being present. When life gets heavy, you disappear, and I can't keep living in that. Evan's eyes flickered, pain. Maybe, but quickly replaced by control. I can try, he said, the familiar promise. Not cruel. Not useless on purpose. Just too late. Lila listened and felt how empty the word try had become. Because she had been living in the waiting room of his trying for months. Years, maybe. She looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. That's how she knew she meant it. I'm not asking you to change now, she said. I'm accepting that you don't want to. Or you can't. Evan stared at her like she had moved the floor under him. That's not true, he said quickly. I care about you. I know, Lila said. And her voice was gentle, not sarcastic. That's why this hurts. Because care isn't the same as connection. The room went very quiet. Evan searched for the right sentence. The one that would restore normal. But there was no normal left to restore. Lila walked to the bedroom and opened a drawer. Not dramatically. Like someone finishing a task. She had packed slowly over the past week, small items first. A toothbrush. A book. The sweater she always wore when she missed home. Evan followed her, watching like he couldn't believe her body was doing what her words had already decided. Where are you going? He asked. Lila paused. I'm going somewhere I don't have to beg to be felt, she said. And it wasn't a threat. It was a fact. She picked up her keys. Evan stood in the doorway, silent, trapped inside his own limits. At the door, Lila turned back once. Not to punish him. Not to win. Just to honor what they were. I hope you find your way, she whispered, and I hope I stop shrinking. Evan didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know how. Lila stepped into the hallway, and the air felt different, colder, freer. Her heart hurt, but it wasn't confused anymore. The separation was quiet. But it was final, in the way quiet truths always are. 15 Healing without closure. The first thing Lila noticed after leaving wasn't freedom. It was silence. Not the silence of Evan's avoidance. A different kind. A silence that didn't ask her to perform. A silence that didn't punish her for having feelings. She moved through her days like someone learning a new language. Simple things felt unfamiliar, making coffee for one. Unlocking her door, choosing what to watch without checking if it would keep someone comfortable. At night, the grief came in waves. Not because she missed Evan's body next to hers. But because her mind kept craving explanations. A reason that would make the pain tidy. She wanted a moment where he finally understood. A text that said, I see it now. A conversation where he held her hands and admitted the truth. But the truth was quieter. She wasn't going to get closure from the person who created the open wound. So Lila started practicing something harder than forgiveness. Acceptance. She accepted that Evan might tell people. It just didn't work out. That he might think she overreacted. That he might move on without ever naming what he did. She accepted that she might never be seen in his story. And in that acceptance, something inside her unclenched. Because closure, she realized, is often a fantasy. A clean ending that emotional unavailability rarely gives. Healing had to be built without it. She began with small rituals. When her chest tightened, she didn't reach for her phone. She placed a hand over her heart and breathed, counting slowly, 4 in, 6 out. She told herself, this feeling is old, it's not a prophecy, it's just a wave. She wrote down the moments she used to erase. The hospital night he didn't come. The way he sighed when she needed comfort. The way, I'm here, meant, don't ask for more. Not to punish him. To protect her memory from rewriting itself. Because loneliness has a seductive trick. It makes you romanticize what hurt you, just to feel connected again. Lila refused that trap. She talked to her sister, to a therapist, to friends who didn't ask her to be easy. She said the words out loud until they lost their shame. I was lonely with him. I made myself smaller. I stayed too long. And each time she said it, the story moved from her body into language. From wound into wisdom. Some mornings she woke up and reached to the other side of the bed out of habit. When her hand met empty sheets, the old ache flashed. But now, she didn't interpret the ache as a sign she should go back. She interpreted it as proof she had loved deeply. And that deep love deserved deep safety. She started to redefine what home meant. Not a person who stays only when it's easy. Not a relationship that rewards silence. Home became a place where her nervous system could rest. Where her tears weren't emergencies. Where her needs weren't negotiations. And slowly, she realized something that felt like closure. Even without hearing it from Evan. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she started loving herself enough to stop disappearing. That was the ending she could give herself. Not a perfect apology. Not a final conversation. Just a quiet, steady decision. I will not return to the version of me that had to beg to be held. 16. Release. There was no single day when Lila woke up, healed. Release didn't arrive like a celebration. It arrived like a quiet loosening. One morning, she poured coffee and realized she hadn't checked her phone for him. Not once. No scanning for a message. No replaying old words. No calculating what silence meant. Just morning. She stood by the window and watched the city move, people walking. Buses exhaling, light shifting across buildings. And she felt something unfamiliar. Space. Not empty space. Safe space. For the first time in a long time, her mind wasn't rehearsing how to be lovable. Her body wasn't bracing for disappearance. She could feel herself returning. It happened in ordinary ways. Laughing too loudly with a friend and not apologizing. Saying, "I don't like that," and not patting it with a smile. Crying during a movie and letting the tears stay on her face instead of wiping them away like evidence. She began to notice her own needs like they mattered. When she felt tired, she rested. When she felt lonely, she reached for people who reached back. When she felt fear, she didn't shrink, she spoke. And slowly, the old belief started to break. That love must be earned by becoming easy. She saw how she had been trained to accept crumbs. And how her heart had called it maturity. But now she knew. Real love doesn't reward your silence. It meets your truth. Real love doesn't vanish when life gets heavy. It stays awkward, imperfect, but present. One evening, Lila found herself walking past a restaurant Evan used to love. For a second, a memory rose up, his laugh, his hand on her back, the warmth she used to chase. And she felt the old ache flicker. But it didn't pull her. It passed through her like wind. That was the moment she understood release. Release isn't forgetting. It's remembering without bleeding. It's letting the past be true. Without letting it be your home. She didn't need him to admit it. She didn't need a final conversation. She didn't need an apology to validate what she lived. Her life was the proof. She had survived a love that made her disappear. And she had chosen a life where she could stay whole. So she made a promise, not to Evan, but to herself. I will never again call anxiety chemistry. I will never again call half love enough. I will never again shrink to keep someone comfortable. And in that promise, she felt the last tie loosen. Not with hate. Not with bitterness. With a quiet respect for the girl she used to be. The girl who tried so hard to be easy. Lila didn't blame her. She simply let her go. And in letting her go, she finally stepped forward. Not into a perfect future, but into her own. If this story hit something tender in you, don't keep it silent. Like this video so it can reach someone who needs it. Comment. Have you ever stayed in a love that felt safe only when you didn't need anything? And share this with a friend who's been shrinking to be loved. Subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more stories that whisper the truth. And remind you that you were never meant to disappear to be chosen.